if you weren't here 3 weeks ago, how many of you were not here 3 weeks ago? So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief recap. So if you were here 3 weeks ago, feel free to take a nap right now, and I'll wake you up when we're back to tonight. So the nature of awareness. Most of us realize that when there's not any awareness, when we are just lost in some long train of thought, the mind tends to shrink around whatever it's mulling over, whatever it's consumed by in the moment. Or maybe it's a strong emotion, anxiety, fear. And the unaware mind tends to keep creating more stories, more fabrication as it spins out. I see a couple of you nodding in assent. And the narrative, the sadness or the resentment or whatever it is that the mind is fixated on tends to grow in those moments as well, because our perspective is very narrow. It's drilled down to one fine point. In such a moment, one of our options is to turn the mind to knowing the clinging, or to know the aversion, so that we're not feeding that, but we're simply aware of the clinging or the aversion. And the curious thing here is that the more we pay attention, easing the body, resting back in awareness, the less solid the object, the less the clinging. And the subject-object division, I am angry, that division, subject and object, tends to dissolve with awareness. Our relationship to the object of anger or to narrative, a story, is altered because now it's been reframed. It's framed as anger is known. We become the knowing. There's not a subject, there's not an object that the mind has gone over to. Yes, there's a consciousness of the object, but the mind, where we're organized, is resting back in awareness. And when we're resting in awareness, the clinging softens, the object has a tendency to dissipate. We can at least begin to see it a little more clearly. When things are known as they actually are, they don't obstruct, they actually clarify. And we become aware that the nature of mind in those moments is actually quite bright. It's lucid. It's empty. There's a sense of calm. And the best news about this is that awareness is available to us as a natural refuge. It's not something we have to manufacture, create, construct. It's already within us. And I talked 3 weeks ago about how as children we knew this. We lose it sometimes as an adult. So this natural refuge that's available to us, this ability to rest back in awareness, is something that's indestructible. It's not arising and it's not passing. It just is. And we can trust it because it's available anytime. It holds everything, every object, including states of confusion, anxiety, worry, grief. It's not an idea and it's not a creation. It just is. So we shift our mindfulness practice, as some of us have done and have learned as a way to focus the attention, to train the attention. We shift from focusing on objects to being mindful of that which knows objects. We habituate the mind to begin to notice, to see a little differently, an exploration that can come from this don't know mind. We form new habits, noticing what's this, And we can help with this training by using phrases such as, anger is known. So again, this natural refuge for the active mind is already here. It's within us. We don't have to construct anything. It's indestructible. It's not passing. It just is. So there's your 3-minute summary. Now those of you who were we're asleep, wake up. We're back. So I said 3 weeks ago that I would continue tonight to explore this topic. What I'd like to do right now is to weave together a little bit more on the nature of awareness with thoughts from an event of this past weekend that I experienced that I hope will give some shape to an understanding, a larger understanding of awareness, and perhaps cultivate our awakening. What was spoken at this event that I experienced and what I want to share with you tonight can not only help enlighten us, but I think it will speak to the aspirations of a collective awakening of the community. So in a way, tonight's talk continues Ali's theme from last week, which was opening hearts to the root of suffering, to becoming more aware of interconnection and interdependency in our awakening. So what was this event? On Saturday night, I had the incredible pleasure of being able to listen to Brian Stevenson speak at the Virginia Festival of the Book. Anybody else there that night? Yeah, several of you. So what I witnessed was someone whose presence, whose awareness, and whose compassion were palpable. And he's written a book, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. But I want to give you a little bit of background information and then let you hear some of what he had to share and then weave together this idea of awareness into some of the things that were spoken that evening. So Brian Stevenson, in case you don't know, grew up in Delaware in the 1960s and 70s. His great-grandparents were slaves here in Virginia. He spent his first days in a classroom in a colored school. By the time he got to second grade, his school had been desegregated, but the old rules of segregation still applied. So black kids played separately from the white kids. Blacks were forced to use the back door at his school. When he was a teenager, his grandfather was murdered in a housing project in Philadelphia. In addition, though, to these early childhood experiences, he tells stories of how his mother and his grandmother played pivotal roles in his life, and actually the lives of all their children and grandchildren. He told stories of his grandmother and his mother, of how compassionate they were, of how they taught him to value redemption over revenge, that what was important was to see each person in this society, any society, as more than the worst thing they had ever done. So just because you had stolen something did not mean that you were only a thief. Just because you had killed did not mean that you were only a murderer. Brian Stevenson became a lawyer, and his practice for the past 30 years has been dedicated to defending the most desperate, the most in need, the poorest, those wrongly condemned, especially those on death row, women and children who are trapped in the farthest reaches of the criminal justice system. 2 years ago, he wrote a book about his experiences. The book is entitled Just Mercy, and it's won numerous literary awards. It's a provocative work of nonfiction that reads like a novel, and what it does is it conveys the reality and the stamina and the heart of those that he's worked with who are imprisoned, and also those who are outside the prison walls. Here are some statements by Bryan Stevenson. We will ultimately not be judged by our technology, nor by our intellect and reason. Ultimately, the character of our society will be known by how we treat the poor, the condemned, and the incarcerated. Another quote. The real question of capital punishment in this country is, do we deserve to kill? And finally, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. So you might pause right now, allowing your eyes to close, breathing. Notice what's arising, thoughts, sensations in the body, feeling states. It can be helpful to relax the body to create some space for things to untangle. Let whatever arises rest. Embody trust. And you might observe the mind's response to contact. So I am angry, I am sad, both implying a subject and an object. What if instead you begin with, anger is known? Becoming the knowing. Not attached to preferences. Practicing with the out-breath. Relaxing and resting, seeing things appear and disappear. Perhaps inquiring, what is knowing the fear or the anger or the sadness? Fear is known, anger is known, sadness is known. What's knowing the fear or the anger or the sadness? So if we can ask that question, what's knowing the fear, the anger, the sadness, or whatever's arising, just in asking that question, we allow a gap to develop, a little space. And it might be possible to see that the mind state is an energy that's arising and perhaps passing. So this attitude of non-interference, of allowing, we begin to recognize that the more I get out of the way of this energy arising, passing, the greater the flow. The mind states as energy can move much more quickly. In his talk on Saturday, Bryan Stevenson suggested that we might consider 4 guidelines for ourselves if we wish to move beyond simply hearing of or reading about. If we aspire to create change in the arenas of poverty and justice. of race and justice. And the first guideline he suggested was to, and these are his words, get proximate. Get proximate. He said, go to the zip codes that you've been told to stay away from, the neighborhoods that people tend to avoid. Get proximate, and I looked this up because I was real curious about the definition of this word. Get adjacent, adjoining, contiguous with. See the bubbles that you have consciously or perhaps unconsciously created in your life for yourself and venture outside of them geographically, psychologically. The second guideline he suggested was to rewrite the narrative. The one that says, these people are dangerous, or that begins with the phrase, those kinds of people, you can't trust them. Learn about perspectives of history that were not part of your education, or about current events that don't make the daily news. The third guideline he suggested is to be hopeful. Don't be dissuaded by the enormity or the complexity of the issue. And the fourth guideline is to take courage, to be willing to be challenged, be willing to be uncomfortable. And so he offered these guidelines, of course, to inspire us, to motivate us perhaps to action. And in reflecting about his talk, what occurred to me was that these guidelines could also serve as aspirations for deepening our own awakening, our own awareness, our collective awakening. So with that in mind, I've just made a few additions to these guidelines that he suggested. The first one, remember, was to get proximate. That one is an invitation to us to wake up to what's true, to be aware. So we acknowledge that we are mindful moment to moment. We're aware of what our response is to someone speaking, to sensations in the body, to thoughts that we have. Sometimes we can almost watch that like it was a movie of our life, the inner thoughts being present to just whatever's unfolding with us. So there's a level of consciousness there. And the suggestion here is that see if there is a way to, as we just looked at in this practice, to acknowledge what's happening from a place of awareness, not an attachment to a particular object. And see perhaps if there are ways that we can apply insights from this practice and from Dharma teachings to situations of social, political, environmental, economic suffering and injustice. So to get proximate, to get intimate with awareness. His second aspiration, to rewrite the narrative, is one that you've already begun. Just by being here, by beginning to practice mindfulness, for example, to meditate, to see that aversion and clinging creates suffering. The old narrative is that we believe that we are in charge of the movie of our life. We believe that not only are we the director of the movie of our life, but we're also the star in it. So actually, the movie is based rather completely on causes and conditions that have arisen with our ancestral roots, our heritages, our cultural conditioning. So, to rewrite the narrative, what would it be like to renounce the stardom? To say that I cease being the star of this movie, of my life. To just be present to unfolding experience and to allow compassion to arise. These words are from a writer on compassion. Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What appears bad manners and ill temper or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down there where spirit meets the bone. The third aspiration, to be hopeful. So in this case, hope is not a clinging to an expectation or an expected outcome, something you desire to have happen, want to have happen. Hope is about energy and about attitude. We can't become present when we're attached. It's too much. When mindfulness is solely on objects, in other words, when we respond to, with aversion to the killing of young black men, when we respond with aversion to the plight of refugees, to the degradation of the planet, when we respond with aversion, there is no space for awareness. Years ago, when I was sitting on a retreat with the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, he asked us to commit to conversations as activists for change. And he made this comment. He said, whatever you're working on, whether it's climate change or racial justice, the outcome might be radically different from what your expectation is, what your hope is. But that does not mean giving up hope. Hope has to do with energy and attitude, qualities of diligence, kindness, perseverance, patience, tolerance. When cognitive dissonance shows up, being confounded, then the role of awareness is the ability to stay centered, a genuine, functional refuge. So the fourth aspiration is to take courage, to be willing to be uncomfortable. So we start with consciousness. If there's a knowing of an object, like sound or the breath or pain, then this implies a subject. So if there's an object here, there must be someone knowing that object. And we did the hand thing 3 weeks ago. But this is where mistaken identity can come in. Yes, there's an object, pain for example, that's being known, but there's an ever-changing set of conditions that are knowing this object. The knowing is something separate that we can rest back into, easing into awareness. Conditioning, of course, means that we'll get snagged again. I've got it, now I've got it. Ugh, that's clinging. Or, I'll never get this. I can't get this. That's aversion. So awareness is a touching and letting be, a kind of cool reactivity that keeps the mind from latching on. The impeded stream, in the writing that I read 3 weeks ago by Wendell Berry, the impeded stream is the one we want to sit by because we can hear the sound of the water rushing over the rocks. So we trust the heart, not the heart that's filled with desire, but the heart that's clear. We can rest back in awareness as a skillful means of staying with the difficulties of life. When we're overwhelmed by the severity of a problem or pain, it can be so severe or large that our regular cognizing cannot handle it. When we turn to awareness, we abandon the object and we thereby make intuition more available to us, and energy can move much more easily. This can show up in what you can bear or be with. Sometimes we tend to over-effort or overthink. Anybody got that going on? Overthinking, over-efforting. We make an object or a concern more difficult than it needs to be. Ajahn Chah would say, you're looking for the horse you're riding on. You're looking for the horse you're riding on. You might try saying this to yourself tomorrow during the course of the day, see what happens. We live in a bit of a paradox. It's our nature to be responsive to suffering, to radiate metta or kindness, friendliness, to offer sympathetic joy. In all of this, our awareness is not moving. So let's sit for a moment. This is a poem entitled The Little Duck. Now we are ready to look at something pretty special. It's a duck riding the ocean, 100 feet beyond the surf. And she cuddles in the swells. There is a big heaving in the Atlantic, and she is part of it. She can rest while the Atlantic heaves, because she rests in the Atlantic. Probably she doesn't know how large the ocean is. And neither do you. But she realizes it. And what does she do, I ask you? She sits down in it. She reposes in the immediate as if it were infinity, which it is. That is religion, and the duck has it. I like the little duck. She doesn't know much, but she has religion. Thank you for your attention and for your practice.